Right. No, because we had this very, I saw this the other day. Yeah.
Well, also. We will. There we go. We will get started in just a few moments. As a reminder, there are no cards and pens at the back tables. If you have specific questions that you would like to ask, what we're going to do as part of our process, just write them out. They will come up to me. I will ask the question and we'll get it answered for you. We'll take that through the end of the evening, and depending on how time goes, we'll see if there's time to pass the mic later. But what we wanted to do is help facilitate the question and answer session. So we'll get started in just a few minutes. Right here. Yep, I will. Oh, can't read this. You're like a doctor. Hi. that I want to write down.
Yeah, I think.
All right. Good evening and welcome to Kensington's public forum and question and answer session on the Attainable Housing Strategies, which has been transmitted from the planning staff to County Council. I wanted to make a few introductions and then explain a little bit how tonight will go. So first and foremost, thank you to everybody who is joining us in person and to everybody else who is watching through Montgomery Municipal Cable. I'd like to welcome you to our town hall on behalf of Mayor Furman and the rest of the Kensington Town Council who are all here, Darren Bartram, Nate Engel, and Ann Lichter. My name is Connor Crimmins. I'm a member of Kensington's Town Council. I also chair our Development Review Board. And so for the past 3 to 4 years, that role means being in a lot of public meetings about First Thrive, Montgomery 2050, and now the Attainable Housing Strategy. And so since there is a lot of talk on our listserv as well as within the community, we've asked some of the experts from Montgomery County Planning to come and talk with us tonight and answer some of the questions that our community has. So with that, I would like to thank Lisa Govini, who is the acting planning supervisor countywide for Montgomery County Planning, as well as James Hedrick, who is a planning board commissioner. They sit up here before you. With them tonight is Matthew Folden, who is here in the event that we have regulatory questions that need a little bit of extra expertise. But with that, I would also like to make a special welcome to our district council member, Kate Stewart, who is also vice president of the Montgomery County Council. And I'd like to ask Kate to just take a few moments to explain how we have gotten here at this moment with attainable housing.
Thank you, and I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. Thank the mayor and I do. Hey, Sam, my toes. I want to thank the mayor and everyone on the town council for convening us this evening, and also thank the planning department and the planning board. Before I get into it, I just want to say that the planning department and the planning board, I know people have very strong feelings about the attainable housing strategies, and we'll talk about them tonight. But they have really been going across the county and doing many of these meetings to listen to folks and spending many nights doing it. And I just want to say, regardless of how we feel about the attainable housing strategies, they've been doing an excellent job on being in community and really listening to people. So I just want to thank them for taking that time. So how did we get here? The attainable housing strategies was requested by the prior county council. So when the prior county council was looking at things like Thrive and other, and looking at the county and development, they asked the planning department and the planning board at that time to put together a plan on how to address, at that time, it was called missing middle housing. Over the last few years, and I know Lisa will go into this and talk about their process, the planning department, the planning board and the planning department worked on what is now called the Attainable Housing Strategies. This document was then put together by the planning department, sent over to the planning board, which then reviewed it and sent it to us, the county council. And the county council received it. This fall, it went to the Planning, Housing, and Parks Committee for a number of work sessions. The council members who are on that, it is chaired by Council President Andrew Friedson, Councilmember Jawando, and Councilmember Natalie Fanny Gonzalez are on that committee. You can watch those committee hearings as the planning department presented to them and the council members asked questions. Those are all on the county website. Because we wanted to make sure that we were also hearing from the public, the county council held 5 in-person meetings just like this across the county and 1 virtual meeting. Those were sort of official county ones, but many of us as district council members have been going to and attending smaller meetings like tonight that is being hosted by the town of Kensington. I want to let everyone know that while we have the attainable housing strategies and these ideas from the planning department and planning board before us, currently there is no legislation that the county council is considering. So after we get all the input on this, and our staff at the county council on October 29th during our county council meeting will be doing a presentation on what we heard from the listening sessions to update us on that. The next step for us after that is to forward any of the ideas that we've heard from members of the public, from the attainable housing strategies, is that a council member would need to draft and introduce what is known as a zoning text amendment, a ZTA. And given the recommendations, it may not be just one, but if somebody wanted to, multiple zoning text amendments. Once the zoning text amendment is drafted and introduced, we need at least 30 days before a public hearing would be held. So our rules are, if you introduce legislation like a zoning text amendment, you have to wait at minimum 30 days and do public notice before there would be a public hearing. So we would have a public hearing. Sometimes on things that are real popular, we have more than just one public hearing. We might have one in the afternoon and one in the evening. Following the public hearing, the legislation would then go to committee. It would go to the Planning, Housing, and Parks Committee. Again, sometimes we have one work session of a committee, sometimes multiple, depending on the complexity of the issue before them. Once it gets through the committee process, then it would come to the full council for a vote. So this is before we actually take any legislative step on any of the ideas that you're going to see today. That would be the process we would need to go through. And as your district council member here, I am making the commitment that before we move forward on any zoning text amendment, and I know Councilmember Crimmins will hold me to this as the person on the town council that reviews this stuff, that we would make sure that we are hearing from all of you here, that we come back again and do this kind of meeting when we actually have a legislation that would be before the county council. So I'm going to be over here while Lisa does a great job tonight going through the attainable housing strategies. My deputy chief of staff, Paul Ellis, is here, and we're always available to answer questions on the process and where the county council fits into all this. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Councilmember Stewart. So real quickly, just procedurally how the evening will go. I've said it before, but I hope everybody knows there are note cards at the back of the room with pens. If you have a question that you would like to submit to be answered, just write it down, put it up. One of us will come along and grab it, and I will moderate those questions. What we have asked planning staff to start with is a short overview of the attainable housing strategies, just so that everybody, we don't know how much or where people are in their knowledge and understanding or exposure to the attainable housing strategies. So the introduction is to help give everybody a baseline of what has been presented to the county council. From there, I will start moderating questions. I am very happy to see that I already have a stack of cards and a number of questions, and I will work to get through all of them. I also have another list of my own questions. Should we run out? I am hopeful, by knowing many of the people in this crowd, you will continue to write down questions, you will continue to pass them up, and we will continue to moderate them to our staff. So at this time, I'd like to ask Lisa to come up and give our presentation. I ask that, right, the point here is for her to present the information. Please, no questions. If you have questions, write them down. I'm going to be watching while she presents. Just hold them up. I'll come and get it from you. And then as she concludes her presentation, we will start the question and answer portion. So with that, I invite Lisa to the podium.
Good evening. I will give a very short intro. We've had a couple of intros so far. I'm James Hedrick from the Planning Commission, Planning Board. We brought Lisa Gavoni tonight, who is our expert on housing, on all things housing. So any questions you have, we'll be happy to answer them. The real quick introduction, Councilmember Stewart covered most of it, and I want to say thank you to her for being here, and thanks to everyone for inviting us. We do have a real housing supply problem, housing affordability problem in the county right now. We're expected to add over 200,000 people in the next 25 years. Lisa's going to cover a lot of this. Housing prices are going up drastically. We are actually losing middle and moderate income people in the county. They're leaving. There's less of them than there used to be. We've looked at this through census data, and you can find it as part of the attainable housing. If I can editorialize briefly, I bought my house in Montgomery County 10 years ago and couldn't afford to live here now if I moved now. So the county council, knowing all this, the previous county council asked us, how can we make there be more housing that is more affordable to moderate income folks around middle income? And what the attainable housing strategies is, and what we're going to discuss tonight, is our best advice to the county council on what we think they should do. If affordable housing and attainable housing is their goal, this is what we think the best options are. And as Councilmember mentioned, there's nothing in writing yet for a law. They will come back to us and tell us if they want us to put something together in what, as she mentioned, it's called a ZTA, or a zoning text amendment. Certainly no far what we have is the strategies. These are our suggestions and recommendations for best practices. We've developed this both with extensive research within Montgomery County and also looking at other jurisdictions around the country, Boston, Seattle, Minneapolis, just over the river in Arlington, et cetera, that have adopted similar policies. So what we have right now is housing mismatch from what people need and from what we have. We have housing costs and prices going through the roof, and we've got a housing supply shortage. It's hurting our economic vitality. It's hurting our housing market. And these are what we have recommended to the county council. And so if you have any questions, Lisa, as I said, is going to go through most of it today. If you have any questions on the details, we'll be happy to answer them. And as I've told other people when I've done this thing, I can out-talk anyone on housing policy, and I will prove it tonight if you want to stay afterwards and we can chat if you don't get your question answered now. So I'll turn it over to Lisa, and she will start going through the presentation.
Is it okay if I sit here so I can flip the slides? Okay. So good evening, everyone. My name's Lisa Gavoni, and I'm an acting planning supervisor for the planning department. I've been there for almost 9 years now, focusing solely on housing policy. I'm really excited to be here tonight. As was alluded to, I've done a lot of these presentations around the county. I think I'm an upwards of 30 now. And I've got to travel all around the county, although I live in downtown Silver Spring, so it wasn't much of a travel tonight, but I'm excited to be here nonetheless. So I'm going to jump right in. Way back in 2021, the prior county council asked the planning board to consider and recommend, quote, zoning reforms that would allow greater opportunities for missing middle housing in Montgomery County. And what missing middle housing means is generally more diverse types of housing, that in between housing between a single family detached and attached and multifamily. So think about, duplexes, triplexes, small apartment buildings. Attainable housing strategy is the resulting effort, which the prior planning board and the current planning board prepared recommendations to allow the development of more diverse housing types in the county. Attainable housing strategies is a study, which means that it has no teeth. To require implementation would require a legislative act, which we'll discuss later. So the planning board really laid out 3 goals for attainable housing strategy. The first is to increase opportunities to meet the county's diverse housing supply needs and obligations, as well as the county's economic development objectives. The second is to really unravel those exclusionary aspects of the county's single-family residential zones to diversify the county's communities by diversifying the county's housing stock. And the third is to create more opportunities for homeownership for more households and more parts of the county. So to know me is to know that I love data and I love to, tell a story with data as much as I can. So I'm going to share a couple of data points before I jump right into the recommendations. So in Montgomery County, the new single-family detached housing units, they're getting larger. The typical home in the 1950s was around 1,600 square feet, ballooning up to nearly 4,000 square feet in the past couple of years. This mainly happens through the tear-down rebuild process in Montgomery County, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's when a smaller home is demoed and in its place becomes a much larger, much more expensive home. In Montgomery County, that is done through a process called by right. And what that means is that it requires no discretionary planning staff, planning board, or planning director review. You simply can go to the Department of Permitting Services and get your building permit to do this. At the same time, we know that size has a big impact on affordability. In 2023, the average detached home in Montgomery County sold for over $970,000 compared to $440,000 for attached structures. And then if you look at the year to date for 2024, it's actually over $1 million for average detached structures. If you look at this chart, you can see the buckets which the home sales fall into. So detached homes in the sale ranges generally are in that 600 to 800,000 range, in that $1 million to $2.5 million range. And then you move down the axis and you see that the green, the attached structures, are mostly in that $400,000 to $500,000 range. And then condos and cooperatives are on the furthest, and they're in that $200,000 to $300,000 range mostly. So this is a map of the applicable zones that will be impacted by the recommendations I'll discuss tonight. So there are 4 zones that have the recommendations applied to them: R40, R60, R90, and R200. And what a zone is a zone tells you what you can do with your property. So in Kensington, the primary zone that's here is R60. R60 right now primarily allows for detached residential housing, and that's it. R40 is a little bit interesting because it does allow duplexes currently, but it's only about 0.5% of the land zone right now, and it's mostly found in Tacoma Park and Wheaton. But generally, R60, R90, and R200 are zones right now that currently only allow detached homes by right. And if you look at Kensington, this is a map that I was alluding to. You can see that generally it's the yellow is the R60 zone. And so I'm going to define a couple of terms that I'm going to be talking about tonight. The first one is the priority housing district. The priority housing district is a straight line buffer of 1 mile from the Metro's red line, the purple line, and the MARC rail station, plus 500 feet from a Thrive Montgomery 25 growth corridor. And I'll talk about what the growth corridor is in a minute, but the priority housing district, what it does is it allows reduced parking, and it allows additional unit types beyond some of what is initially recommended in some of the zones. So Kensington is, because of the proximity to the MARC station, in a priority housing district. So as was mentioned earlier, we recently passed our general plan, Thrive Montgomery 2050. And what this general plan does is it sets out policy guidance for future development in the county and future land use activity. It really does the guiding post for a lot of what we do at the planning department, including a lot of our upcoming and current master plans. In Thrive Montgomery County, it identified these growth corridors: Connecticut Avenue, Georgia Avenue, Maryland 355, New Hampshire Avenue, Old Georgetown Road, Randolph Road, River Road inside the Beltway, University Boulevard, US 29, and Veers Mill. Identified these areas of where we want to prioritize growth in the next 30 years. So jumping right into the recommendations, the planning board recommended 3 scales of recommendation. The first is that it's a small scale, which is recommended for the interior of single-family neighborhoods. So we're talking a lot about the neighborhoods around this area. And they would be allowed to build house-size multi-unit structures like duplexes and triplexes with conformance with a pattern book. And I'll talk about what the pattern book is in a few slides. Then there's the medium scale recommendations, which is recommending a new optional method of development. What an optional method development it does is it trades development flexibility in exchange for a public good. In this case, it would be size limited units because, like I said earlier, size has a big impact on affordability. But you're also, for getting that flexibility, you also have to go through discretionary planning staff and planning board or planning director review. And then finally, the large scale recommendations, that is for, we're targeting for our master plans, segments of those growth corridors. So right now, for example, we're working on the University Boulevard corridor plan, not too far away, where there's actually a meeting tonight where they're working with the community on developing a long-term vision for that area. And part of that vision is developing housing recommendations and land use recommendations. So I'm going to jump right into the recommendations. The first, what I talked about, is small scale recommendations. That type of housing would be duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes that are similar in size to existing detached houses as they are allowed to be built today. The existing height limits would be maintained, and it would be allowed in the R60 zone, duplexes and triplexes everywhere, and then quadplexes in that priority housing district. It would be allowed by right with conformance to that pattern book, which again, I'll mention in a second. And the development standards would not change to what is permitted now for detached homes. There'll be no changes to height, setbacks, or lot coverage, but there would be there is currently a recommendation for reductions on on-site vehicle parking. And that implementation tool that would make this possible would be that zoning text amendment. And as was discussed earlier, a zoning text amendment is really a legislative piece, a legislative item that modifies the text of the zoning code. It's similar to a bill, how it modifies sections of county code, but a zoning text amendment modifies the chapter 59, the zoning ordinance. I'm just going to walk through these maps really quickly. This is a countywide map of the areas of the county that are recommended for duplexes. This is the areas that are recommended to allow triplexes. And then this is the area of the county recommended to allow quadplexes. And that pattern book I discussed earlier is really a visual representation of the development standards. We've been working on the attainable housing strategies for several years now, and one of the concerns that we heard is just physical compatibility of these structures with the existing structures. So we think of the pattern book as a really helpful guide to kind of guide the development to fit in to the existing zoning regulations. It would dictate things like massing, the building structure, its size, what we're calling neighborly house details, things like porches and front stoops, where we want to see that on-site parking, where the building is placed on the lot, and things like frontage design, which is how that building communicates with the street. Next, I'm going to jump into the medium scale recommendations. So the medium scale recommendations are the housing types we're talking about here are townhouses and stacked flats and small apartment buildings. So stacked flats, what they are is they are 2 units, one stacked on top of each other. They look like townhouses from the outside, but they are actually 2 units. The height would be around 3 to 4 stories high, so a little bit higher than the detached house, and would be allowed in R60 and R90 within 500 feet of a Thrive Montgomery 2050 growth corridor. It would be implemented through that optional method of development. And again, that optional method of development, what it does is it exchanges greater flexibility for setbacks with a public benefit. For example, the public benefit we're asking in this for attainable housing is size limited units. So the units would be limited to an average unit size of 1,500 square feet, because we know that size has a big impact on affordability again. The development standards would be a little bit more flexible than what would be allowed for the small scale recommendations. They would be similar to what we see today for the existing optional method of development that we have, which are a little bit more flexible than the current development standards for small scale, but not as quite as flexible as they are for our mixed use zones. And again, this would be implemented through that zoning text amendment, that vehicle to make changes to the zoning code. So this is the areas of the county that would be allowed to build the medium scale housing. And if we zoom in on Kensington, you can see that its proximity to Connecticut Avenue would allow up to small apartment buildings along Connecticut Avenue in Kensington. Those blue parcels would be the ones identified. And again, I also have a web map that I can send after this so everyone can zoom in and see the recommendations. I know it's hard to see a little map. And finally, the large-scale recommendations. We're targeting segments of the growth corridors through the master planning process to build stack flats and townhouses and apartment buildings that are 4 stories and higher. It would have, similar to how it is implemented today, it would have to go through the preliminary and site planning process, which means planning staff review, planning board review, and there's options and opportunities for public comment. The development standards for large scale would follow the existing, are similar to the existing development standards that exist today in our mixed use zones, our commercial residential zones, which are the most flexible. And again, that implementation vehicle would largely be a master plan or a local map amendment, which is when an applicant applies for a rezoning of a specific parcel. So I always make this joke and it always falls flat, but I'm going to do it anyway. This is the part of the presentation where I usually say if the tomatoes aren't out, they're out right now because we're talking about reductions to parking. So because Kensington is in a priority housing district, and it generally, from at least driving around, there is street parking, there would be a the recommendations are up for a 75% reduction in parking minimums. So for example, a duplex, the entire duplex, 2 units would only have to provide 1 unit. I do want to add that this has become, like during the listening sessions, this was probably one of the biggest things that was brought up, and the council president at the time said this is something that if there is legislation, we will definitely discuss this. But for the planning board, it was really important to push these parking minimums. Parking gets added on to the cost of housing, and we really have this new general plan that is really prioritizing multimodal and pedestrian safety. So that's part of the impetus for these recommendations. It's also a parking minimum, not a parking maximum. Oftentimes we hear that you're free to provide more parking than is required. So that is also something to consider. And so I received questions earlier that had been sent previously about historic preservation. Historic preservation is not my area of expertise, but I do have coworkers that are. So I very kindly asked them to make me a slide about historic preservation. And the general consensus for historic preservation is the existing processes that are in place are not changing. A historic area work permit is still required for any alterations within locally designated historic districts and for designated historic sites. The HPC would review proposals for construction, addition, modifications, grading, and tree removal, and using existing adopted design guidelines for the properties within the districts. A review of the proposed construction is conducted in public at the HPC meetings and affords local area advisory panels and the general public the opportunity to participate in consideration of the new construction development in historic districts. Properties in the National Registered District, but not in the local district, do not receive HPC review. And then I added my coworker's contact because I will send this presentation, and should there be any additional questions about HP, that historic preservation that I cannot answer, she said that she would be happy to answer any questions. So as was discussed earlier, there's no current legislation on attainable housing strategies. Nothing has been written and nothing has been introduced. What was sent up was a study. Those are the planning board's recommendations, but it requires no action, has no requirement for action. And should a zoning tax amendment be introduced, the council could pick some elements of the planning board's recommendations, none of the elements, all of the elements. There's really, next steps is probably not the best title for this slide because the council has made it very clear that they were focusing on the listening sessions, and now we're going to focus on getting that feedback from the listening sessions to the council. And should a zoning tax amendment be introduced, it would follow those normal processes that were discussed earlier with public hearings and work sessions. I've received a lot of questions. Well, how long do you think the legislative process would take? I've been here for almost 9 years now, and the best comparison that I have is in 2019 We updated the accessory dwelling unit ordinance. The zoning tax amendment was introduced in January. It was not acted on until right before August recess, and that was a lot less complex of a legislative proposal than what is being proposed in attainable housing. So the moral of the story here is that we are at the very beginning of the process, and there's still a lot of work to be done. So thank you. And one other thing is, Councilmember Stewart talked about providing feedback, that the council staff is compiling feedback. There's a link on this last slide that you could click that will take you, and you go to the very bottom, there's a provide feedback button that you can also submit your feedback. But thank you all for having me.
Thank you, Lisa. On that last point, I will start there. There's been a request that feedback, the link that Lisa just shared, be submitted by this Friday, October 18th at 5 p.m. so that the council can take it into consideration in a work group that I understand they are scheduling for next week. So if you have specific feedback and you would like it to be considered for that, please make sure it's in by the 18th. So we will start with our question and answer. I do have a stack of cards. If you came in a little later, just a reminder, there are no cards in the back, pens. If you've got a question that you haven't heard asked yet, please write it down, hand it to any one of the council members, Mayor Tracy. It'll find its way up here, and then we will proceed with asking it. So I will start with the first question, which is, where in the 165-page document is there any data in this plan that supports goal number 3 of increasing ownership?
That's a really great question. So there is a part of the document that discusses a potential future subdivision regulation amendment. And so what a subdivision regulation amendment is, like a zoning tax amendment that modifies this chapter 59, a subdivision regulation amendment modifies the subdivision chapter. And what that would do is, what is in that text is, it would allow for easier subdivision of these lots to create fee simple ownership. And that is something that we heard is the biggest hindrance, because right now these units would have to be condoized in order to make them ownership. But there is a complementary discussion of a subdivision regulation amendment in the report.
Another question, maybe I should have started with this one. Could you quickly just differentiate between affordable housing
Sure.
and attainable housing, and what this plan is aiming to do, if anything, for both of those two types of housing?
Sure. So affordable housing, and I'm going to let Mr. Hedrick jump in if he wants, because this is a subject matter of expertise, is really income restricted housing that has a means test attached to it. It's usually subsidized by the government, and it makes those units affordable to households that are income tested. What we are talking about here today is attainable housing, which is market rate housing that is more affordable than new detached structures due to its size and type of housing. One of the things that we found is, there's a lot of people in this county that just need housing. They don't necessarily need affordable housing. And then we don't want them to take away the resources that we need to provide true affordable housing. So we want to focus on creating a more attainable market for homeownership and housing too.
Yeah, that's very good. And just to add on to that, my career has been in affordable housing, subsidized housing. So typically when we discuss affordable housing, usually that's meant, as you said, means tested or government subsidized housing. It could be a voucher, it could be homes owned by say HOC or something like that, or another mission-driven organization. This is more directed toward middle and moderate income folks in the county, around the 60, 80, 100% of what we call AMI, which is average median income or area median income. And so this is by design directed toward that portion of the population primarily, and it's primarily because we're losing that part of the population. We have less of those folks in that income bracket than we used to. I will add just a little bit, as a former chair of a public housing authority, attainable housing makes it easier for mission-driven organizations like public housing authorities, that would be HOC, or mission-driven organizations, say Habitat, to buy and develop moderate income housing for moderate income folks. We've done it in the past a lot. The recent increase in prices over the last couple of decades has really pushed home ownership out of reach for a lot of the folks within affordable housing programs. In the last year that I was chair, we had one person out of about 1,000 people that were part of our programs move from affordable subsidized government housing into purchasing their own house.
Next, following that train of thought, Thrive 2050, which was the update to the county's general plan, occurred last year. And as a part of it, in Appendix B10, there was a lot of talk about neighborhood change and displacement risk for different populations, specifically lower income or BIPOC residents. In there, the planning board stated that additional work needs to be done around how to preserve naturally occurring affordable housing, what's known as NOAA. How now, with the Attainable Housing Strategies proposed plan, does that not put a target on naturally occurring affordable housing stock by taking it out of inventory and replacing it with multifamily housing?
I can start on this one. So for the attainable housing, most of this is actually going to be targeted, and we've seen this in research in other jurisdictions, at the tear down market. So mostly what we're talking about here is smaller and multiplexes replacing what would become large, McMansions. Lisa showed the square footage replacements. So when people are building single family homes in the tear down market and in places like Clarksburg, they tend to be very, very large and are priced by square foot out of the range of anybody. So what we have from a lot of the research that we've done and where we looked at for other jurisdictions is that building attainable housing like this actually prevents gentrification. And that's one of the reasons we're doing it. So this is not typically going after what we call, I've never been a huge fan of the phrase naturally occurring affordable housing. It's all based on policy. It doesn't just spring up. But it's not really those that we call naturally occurring affordable housing that would be the targets of these sort of policies. This is something particularly with the small scale that's going after the tear down market, that's taking older homes and then turning them into very, very large, very, very expensive homes in different areas. This really isn't targeting sort of the NOAA. If you do want to preserve naturally occurring affordable housing, the way to do that is to really do things like we've done in Montgomery County, like the Housing Production Fund and the Housing Innovation Fund, that give HOC the ability to go out, purchase, preserve, and build housing that's subsidized and maintain that as affordable housing, affordable to lower income folks. When I was chair of Rockville's Public Housing Authority, we did it with several naturally occurring affordable housing apartments there, and that's one of the ways that you do that. This is really targeted toward more of what we like tear down market and the McMansion market.
I don't have much to add to that, but I would say that, the conversation around naturally occurring affordable housing in this county has been ongoing for several decades, way before me. I think that, it is a significant tension point in the housing discussion, especially when we're talking about master plans. I would say that we've made a lot of strides in this area. We recently passed, I would say, the Tacoma Park Minor Master Plan Amendment, which I think has the strongest language about no net loss of affordable housing of any master plan that we've worked on. And we're currently working with DHCA on how we can make sure that that policy is implemented when we get development proposals in.
So Lisa, that actually kind of leads us right into a topic that I've got multiple questions around, which is, why do this through a zoning text amendment and not some update to master plans? The Kensington sector plan was only adopted, about 12 years ago. It was a considerable process to go through, but why not address these types of changes across the county by looking at it through localized planning amendments?
Sure, that's another great question. I would say, we talked about this at length with the planning board, and the planning board felt that the housing crisis is too big to be tackled over the next 30 years by segment of the growth corridors. But I would also say the master planning process has a role in attainable housing strategies. I talked about that large scale housing, where we will go growth corridor by growth corridor throughout this county and look at a denser product than what is being recommended for attainable housing along those corridors.
Don't have much to add to what Lisa said, is that we really do have an acute problem that's come up, that's been brewing for a while, but has really gotten a lot worse, particularly over the last decade. And to go through all the master plans that we have, and there are several dozen of them countywide, would take a very, very long time. We have some that are 25 to 30 years old, and we would still need to go through that. We can get a couple of those done a year. We have a housing crisis that requires action sort of now. So The short answer is that the county council asked us to. The longer answer to even than that is that there is an equity aspect to doing it countywide at the same time, that we are all in this together. We understand and recognize that we have a housing crisis and that we are doing it countywide for that very reason, mostly countywide.
To that, there's a question about kind of what is the aspect of countywide? Because it is noted that there are large parts of the county that are being left out of this plan. Some because they have their own zoning authority, City of Rockville and Gifford, et cetera. But others like Potomac outside of the Beltway seem to have been left entirely out of this, while other parts of the county are being zoned directly into it.
Sure. So I think there are pockets of Potomac that are impacted, and I can speak for experience. I was at West Montgomery Civic Association last week talking to them about this. There are other zones, that single-family zones, the estate zones, the RE2, RE2C, that are not being recommended for attainable housing strategies, largely because of the lack of infrastructure that is there compared to the 60, 90, and 200.
Yeah. And just so obviously the agricultural reserve sort of cut out of it to begin with. And then it's really a balancing act between the existence of infrastructure, particularly transportation and water and sewer. A lot of those places don't have access to easy water and sewer once you get off the standard residential zones. And so it's a balancing act between the availability, particularly of transportation and water infrastructure, and then where we can put things. So it tends to be, as we said, the priority housing districts that were established tend to overlap in areas that are close to multiple metro stations.
Would you describe who you envision occupying the attainable houses based on your comment that the size parameters to be roughly 1,500 square feet? What do you envision as the number of people per unit and the income of those types of residents?
Sure. So I think it looks differently throughout the county. I'll let Mr. Hedrick tell his story, but he will tell you that he lives in a house of similar size in Twin Brook with his 3 kids. So I think that, we've heard a lot, 1,500 is too small. 1,500 is, the average size of a house built in the 1950s in this county. So we think that, it's plenty big. I live in 600 square feet. So, I think that, the price points and and who lives in it looks differently throughout the county. So I don't know if I could, precisely answer that. But just to say that I think that, 1,500 because is a good average starting size to target for the medium scale.
Yeah. So when we put the square footage target size, and we discussed that pretty extensively at the planning board, it was meant to make sure that the multiplex development and the multifamily development that came with the attainable housing into the medium scale in particular would be affordable to people that were in that moderate middle income brackets. That's who we were targeting. There's a reason that 1,500 square foot in there. And so you can see it's not exactly linear, but the larger the house and the more square footage, the more it costs. And you can get more units and smaller units in if you put a limit on that square footage size. And as I said, I have 3 kids, myself, my wife, and a cat in less than 1,500 square feet in my house. And it fits them most of the days. Most of the time they're all able to fit in there. But the size of the home is also just dependent on what people want to purchase and what people want. And if it doesn't sell, it won't get built.
Right. And the other part that I think was mentioned is that the small scale recommendations, there is currently no size limitation, but it would be smaller than a new detached home, given that it would have to be built in the same existing footprint.
So if attainability is the goal of AHS, why isn't the issue of demo and rebuild, the replacement homes, being addressed by removing it by right and restricting the size of buildings or tear downs? Why is that not part of AHS or our housing strategy?
Sure. I think that's a good and valid question. The short answer is that was not what we were asked to study. That issue was studied not too long ago. Well, I guess pretty long ago was the late, I think it was like 2008. And what came out of that study was the infill compatibility guidelines in the zoning code, which does limit the lot coverage for new tear downs compared to other structures. So I think that is a valid question, is, when we are discussing attainable housing, should we be looking at tear down rebuilds? Other jurisdictions, I think, believe Portland also looked at that within their own study on the issue.
Yeah. And just to add on to that, there's not really much else to say on that, but restricting by right development of a large scale house or a McMansion doesn't address the supply problem. The fundamental problem is there's a lack of housing. And stopping the tear down market doesn't actually affect the supply of housing at all, and it certainly doesn't make it more affordable.
So with that, there's been different conversation around, is AHS a solution or a tool? And so what in detail is the basis for planning's belief that attainable housing option would only be incrementally adopted and would only represent, at least at first, a small percentage of the county's housing stock?
Sure. So we, like Mr. Hedrick said earlier, we know that this is going to happen in the existing tear down rebuild market. We can look at other jurisdictions this has happened to. The county averages about 200 tear downs a year. And so some fraction of that would probably be attainable housing units, that we hope. We've also had conversations with small builders who have, made it very clear that this is not a housing unit that's currently in Montgomery County. This would require a pivot on their part in terms of product being built, and not saying that they wouldn't do it, but it will be, it will take a change in the product that they typically are building right now in that custom home tear down rebuild market. So we think that, implementation will be slow. We hope that it's not always slow, but I think at the beginning we can expect that. We also have planned check-ins with the planning board and the county council. Should this be implemented 2 years and then maybe every 4 years after, about like what production looks like, but also other things like, is this negatively impacting infrastructure and other issues that we can monitor through the proposal.
Yeah. And I mean, to add to that also, really second everything that Lisa said, we've also seen what's happened in other jurisdictions, and we've seen the adoption of these type of missing middle housing. That was something that was very common typically before the 1960s, before the middle of the century, and has not become common now. So you do have a lot of builders that are out of practice at it. And so you do have a few years of adoption while they get used to building within this type of structure as opposed to a larger scale frame house type of structure. So when we've seen it in other jurisdictions, we've seen a slow and gradual adoption as it goes on, mostly, as I said, through the tear down market.
So there are a number of questions around infrastructure that I will get into next, and many of them are very specific to Kensington and the Kensington area. So to begin with, one is that homes within the town of Kensington are clustered into the Walter Johnson boundary area. Just this year, Walter Johnson High School, which was built to accommodate 2,300 students, surpassed a total enrollment of 3,078. How will allowing more density impact our local schools? And won't this just lead to further overcrowding within our current schools?
Sure. So I think, I know this does no solace to the students at Walter Johnson now, but I think there is relief coming. I would also say that we have existing processes in place. We have an adequate public facilities ordinance that is implemented through the growth and infrastructure policy, which is currently at the council for review right now. And what the growth and infrastructure policy does is it largely looks at two elements, but schools and transportation, but also looks at water resources, parks, and other public infrastructure, fire and rescue, for example. And we have existing mechanisms in place to monitor the impact. I would also say that these units pay impact taxes. And what impact taxes do is they go to the MCPS's budget to add money for capacity adding projects. So that is the other one thing, that these units will be paying impact taxes to help add capacity to MCPS schools.
Yeah. And I would also bring up that in addition to the APFO, which is adequate public facilities, which looks at schools, and the GIP, growth and infrastructure policy, we have utilization premium payments for overcrowded school districts if they tend to be overcrowded. Also, one of the things that we looked at when developing the attainable housing strategies is what type of housing produces students. And what produces students is not new construction or density in particular, it's me. I am the problem. I moved into my house. There was a very nice lady that lived there who was 70 years old. She retired. She moved down to North Carolina. She had not had a kid in that house probably for at least 30 years. I moved in and we immediately had 3 children. The problem is people in the turnover, not necessarily new density, that create and produce the largest amount of new students. So in addition to this, we have estimates of student generation rates for the different types of housing that will be part of both the small to medium and the large scale. So one of the things that I just want to get across, and we go over this and have for many years now, turnover is the issue of existing homes. That is the one that produces the most students per unit, not necessarily increased density or increasing duplexes or multiplex.
You mentioned that the infrastructure planning at the county level will look at capacity adding projects for school. Down county, there's very little large assembled parcels to build new schools. If I'm up to date, but correct me if I'm wrong, for high school, it's 10 acres. For middle school, it's about 5 acres. So when you talk about capacity adding projects, is this to add wholesale new schools to relieve overcrowding at the current schools? Or is this simply adding additional square footage to the schools we have now to make them larger?
I believe the code calls it teaching stations. So how that is referred to is it could be new additions. It could be new construction. It's not really limited in that regard. I would say you're right. You know, there isn't a lot of land left down county to build new schools, but that doesn't mean we can't get creative with how we, you know, where our children are going to schools. At the planning department, we've talked a lot about, you know, reusing office space, vacant office space, or finding new solutions to help making sure that our students have the school capacity.
Yeah, I mean, it is a really good question, and that's one of the things that's not sort of really under our purview for what we have. What we can provide and what we have provided is an estimate of the number of students that we have, a very good, very tight estimate of the number of students that we produce by any particular type of housing, the number that we project to be in a particular district in any given year, and any projected out, you know, into the future. And as Lisa said, we've recommended a number of times different options that we can help with at the planning department to find those locations to facilitate the use of county property, existing property. Do we need to buy here? Where would it be? And then you also have the issue that was really not within our purview too, of sort of the districting of different individual school districts.
So Montgomery County is filled up of many wonderful neighborhoods and communities, none as wonderful as Kensington. But the question is, will the pattern book vary by neighborhood or town or municipality, as each one has a slightly different characteristic? For instance, in this question, we have a very robust historic district. How will the pattern book, is it a one size fits all, or will pattern books be specialized by communities?
It will not be specialized by community. It's not really meant to be a tool of aesthetics, but really a visual representation of the zoning code. However, we do want to hear from the community. Should this be a recommendation that is implemented, we have talked about making sure that when we're developing the pattern book, that we're talking to the community about what they like to see in terms of what they would like to see in that pattern book.
Yeah, mostly the pattern book is as much for the builder to know what the setbacks and massing requirements are so that it fits within the neighborhood, as opposed to sort of the aesthetic extra characteristics. So we're saying, when we're talking about neighborhood feel, you know, the door needs to be close to the front, no parking in the front, all right? If we don't want to have additions of, say, like a neighborhood character thing of a historic district, you know, it should have this type of trim or these types of colors or things like that. Perfectly reasonable to put in there and to discuss having in there 4 different things. We talked about this somewhat at Somerset, I think, when we were there a couple weeks ago. But the pattern book is as much to, it needs to look like the houses that are around it within the scale of it. So it's the massing for the architectures and the builders, not so much sort of that it looks like the house exactly next door, but that it doesn't look like a different type of structure.
I like what you said, Kevin. I'm going to pull at that thread.
Yeah. Also, when I put my pitch in for Twinbrook, is also a very nice neighborhood. So it's a personal thing, but I really
You said the pattern book is designed, or when it is designed, its goal is to help multifamily housing structures look like or similar to the housing around it. Kensington, like other municipalities, has slightly more restrictive land use ordinances, which are afforded to us under state law. How will those regulations be maintained so that we can continue to regulate the land use provisions that we already have today, so that we can continue to have not just the homes, but the entire lots looking similar to the ones next door?
That's a really great question, and one that's come up a lot during my discussions with municipalities. For those that don't know, municipalities are allowed to make things more restrictive, things like setback height. That is afforded to, the state law is, it's okay. The state law is not as clear as how this would apply to multi-unit structures as it is for detached structures, but I know the municipalities have been working with the state on this issue, and planning has made it, very clear in our discussions that we would support any change to law that would allow you to guide these multi-unit structures as similar to how you guide the detached structures now.
Yeah. In other municipalities, we've talked about specifics related to sort of stormwater infrastructure and stormwater management, because we've got places around the county that have different types of soils and different types of elevations and things like that. That's all perfectly within the purview of something like the attainable housing strategies. This is more the housing part of it. That was something that would come in the ZTA, or that we just wouldn't address within the ZTA.
The next two questions are related somewhat to accessory dwelling units or ADUs, because there has been some corollary that, what we're trying to do is add additional housing units in single-family areas, and an ADUs passed, as you said, in 2019. Does planning have statistics, and can they provide it, as to who is currently renting these available type of units, ADUs, apartments? And on a broader statement, what does planning know about who is coming into the county, who is leaving the county, and what the housing types are that they are looking for?
Sure. So we don't have statistics about accessory dwelling units. I can tell you that when we passed the update in 2019, we were averaging about 30 a year, and now we're getting about 60 to 70. So not a lot, but still cumulative. It's the cumulative effect. It's important to make these changes. The Department of Housing and Community Affairs is the agency that regulates accessory dwelling units. They do have a rental survey for that you have to fill out things like rent on in the survey for multifamily and single family detached. I wish they had it for accessory dwelling units. I think that's a really good idea. But that is currently not there. I will say that I don't know the date, but I know the county, I saw this on the agenda today, that the PHP committee is having another discussion on accessory dwelling units coming up.
And just to add to that, and I mentioned it earlier in the introduction, is we know generally who's coming into the county and where the population is increasing by income stratification, things like that. And as I said, we're losing that middle to moderate income. So between 60 and about 128% of AMI. We know that we're getting wealthier people coming into the county. We know we're increasing some at the lower end of the income spectrum. We're missing and losing that moderate. We know that in the aggregate.
Along the line of infrastructure, parking is kind of a hot button issue. So per the recommendations within the plan, because we have a mark station right there, and the entire town is a half a square mile, and the recommendation is that within 1 mile of a mark station, you would have this priority housing district. And as Lisa, you shared, that would mean reducing the parking requirement by up to 75%. So, putting it down to 1 unit. Not that that has to be done, but that is the recommended reduction. When looking at that reduction, what standards did the county planning use? Because not everywhere in the county's roads are uniform. For instance, here in Kensington, and certainly other jurisdictions nearby, our roads are actually quite a bit narrower, because we are in an older part of the county, than what is standard and applied in the planning and design guidelines. So we have a number of streets that are 20, 21, maybe 22 feet wide. And the concern is having a parking reduction requirement means largely those cars would be moved to the street. And then how does that comport with fire and safety standards to get fire and safety apparatus, garbage trucks, school buses down our town streets?
I'll go for it.
Oh, no, sure. So I can say that, we generally looked at this through the county-wide scope, where we didn't really look at one neighborhood specific details. I would say that those concerns are valid. I think this is going to be probably, if a zoning text amendment is introduced, the biggest discussion point beyond the types of housing. I would say, like I said, I've done 30 of these, and parking is 1A and infrastructure is 1B. So I think that those are going to be, big points of discussion. But I can just tell you that we looked at it from a countywide scope and prioritizing the Thrive Montgomery 2050 policy guidance of reducing parking.
And just to add to that, when we were asked by the county council, we were asked for strategies and recommendations and policies for affordability and attainability, and also the viability of producing these types of units. Parking adds a ton of expense to a unit. And we were trying to provide something to the county that was practical and not just window dressing. So if you really want to produce an attainable unit that's affordable to moderate and middle income people, you have to talk about the parking, because parking can add $50,000 per unit in cost. It can be very expensive, and it can be very hard to fit it onto a lot and then still not address or not remove the setback requirements, not remove open space requirements and things like that. So like I said, when we talked about which zones were included, was a back and forth between viability and closeness to infrastructure. When we're talking about parking, and I think Lisa's right that this is one of the issues where we're going to have the most debate, is when you ask us for affordability, we're going to give you the best answer we can. Parking really, really increases the cost, and that's something we have. If we want more parking, the prices of these homes are going to be more expensive, and that's something to trade off. When we went through the parking, we went through it and we looked at the priority housing districts that we've already established. All of those have to be and are required to be near infrastructure, transportation infrastructure. I think that when you get to the actual practical aspect of building these homes and people purchasing these homes, there's going to be a selection effect involved. And if you need 2 cars, you're not going to be able to purchase one of these homes. It's not going to work for you as a house. We also looked at making sure that if there was on-street parking, that was a requirement, and the priority housing districts are a requirement for reducing the parking. So as Lisa said, this is countywide. When we look at things like fire department access and things like that, all that is taken into account, through portions of the code. But when they asked us about affordability, this is one of the areas that if you look around the country and if you look at the research, the cost of parking is exceptionally high and has a massive, massive impact on the affordability, colloquially speaking, affordability of the units.
One other thing is we tried to align our parking recommendations with the reduced parking requirements for the accessory dwelling unit ordinance. So that was one of the other things that I think was a huge guide for us.
On that very point, correct me, I'm not going to say I memorize everything, but I believe under ADU, one of the things that was modified was proximity to MARC. And that is a huge issue here in the town of Kensington, because like, as I mentioned, we have a MARC station. So the priority housing districts are determined based on your proximity to Metro Rail, to the future Purple Line, to a BRT station, or to MARC. Those types of transit are not the same. So for instance, Forest Glen has a daily ridership value of about 2,500 riders. Strathmore Grosvenor, it's about 4,800 riders. MARC's current, as of July, ridership numbers are 80 at the Kensington station, 80. At Garrett Park, it's 18 daily riders. Those seem vastly different from the numbers we're talking about with MARC. How are those two types of transit being looked at the same for creating or including the walk shed for a priority housing district?
Yeah, I can jump in on this one. Again, this is a balance between the infrastructure and the access. And so MARC has capacity that is not being utilized. That is 100% true. And we've included it as something that is a piece of infrastructure capable of carrying people and more people than it does. MARC is transportation infrastructure that we have, just like the metro stations. It doesn't carry as many people, but it is there, and it is an infrastructure capacity that we have, and we felt it was necessary to include it. Again, this is recommendations.
So a couple more questions. How can homeowner development be prioritized over developer development? Is there, nothing was talked about in the plan. Are there strategies from other jurisdictions? How do we stop making this seem like a handout toward developers?
I think this, practically speaking, no one that anyone thinks of a developer is going to touch it. It's not large enough and it's not large scale enough, really. So most of this, as we see, and like Lisa said, and from looking at other jurisdictions, this is the homeownership builder market. This is the folks that build McMansions, the tear down market, the home builder market. It's not really people like JBG or anyone like that that touches these kind of things. It's not large scale enough. So for a homeowner development, a homeowner is probably capable of doing something like this, a duplex development or ADU style development of adding another unit within their own capability. They wanted to hire a general contractor. Otherwise, the home builder market's probably where it's going to be. I don't think it's, practically speaking, it doesn't really have much of appeal for large scale developers.
But I also think, an important part of this is, and I think this is a really good point is, we talked a lot about, when we talk about accessory dwelling units, we call them granny flats, we got rid of the owner occupancy requirement. Right now, you can either live in the ADU or the principal dwelling so that you can age in place, you can move to that accessory dwelling unit. We see this as something similar that homeowners would be able to convert their property to a duplex. There's not a lot of differences between an attached ADU and a duplex. And so we see that very similar as we also see this as, a great tool to age in place and to help homeowners be able to convert their property.
There's plenty of good and reasonable vacant land all across Montgomery County. Why not start there with focused plans and strategies for those areas, as opposed to looking at infill development in down county communities?
Sure. So there actually, unfortunately, isn't a lot of vacant land in the county. I think there, when we've looked at it, various times, we just looked at it through a residential capacity analysis, and there's about 15% of our land available for development or redevelopment. And the land that is available for development is pretty sprawly. We know that to meet our climate goals, we can't really, sprawl is not the best tool to do that. We think that it's important to double down on areas where we have existing infrastructure in place to be able to, get people out of their cars and closer to existing job centers too.
Just to double up on what Lisa said, there's not as much vacant land as we think. Most of the large parcels are sort of either already existing or in the process of development or redevelopment or something like that. So again, for climate reasons, for sprawl reasons, things like that, looking at this infill development, we do see turnover. We see turnover, as we've said many times, with the tear down market. So there is turnover, and that's where, that's really what Attainable Housing Strategies is looking at. There's just not as much vacant land as there used to be.
If the goal is to create more attainable housing, then why does it feel like we are just looking at single family homes near Metro or Mark in areas that are already more expensive? Why aren't we targeting these other areas of the county more?
Sure. So I think, if you looked at that, map, we are not just targeting down county. There are, we had a listening session in Germantown. We went to Olney a couple of weeks ago. Like, we are having this conversation countywide in places where attainability looks different. At the same time, it's important to create more opportunities for home ownership or just housing in general, because there's nothing wrong with renting as a renter throughout this county, and looking, the best place to do it is near existing transit infrastructure.
Again, this goes back to sort of balancing just infrastructure and equity across the county. And it is, as Lisa said, we're going all the way from Germantown to Olney down to Chevy Chase. We've gone throughout the county, and this covers most of the county by design, because that was the recommendations we were asked for. How do you get more attainable housing? You put it throughout the county, you spread it out amongst the county, you don't concentrate it in any one set of areas within the county or any one set of neighborhoods. You spread it throughout the county where you have the infrastructure to support it, both sort of sewer, water, schools, and transit primarily.
So several times you've mentioned that attainable housing, right, is different from affordable housing. Affordable housing has some sort of government subsidy to it to capture, bring down the total cost to the homeowner or renter. With attainable, the idea is to create more units at a price point that more people can afford. So with that, the other thing you've mentioned is that everything is market rate. The market will determine what those prices may be. If in the current market, a home is purchased by a developer for 5, 6, 800,000, but then turned into a replacement home. If the market shows that that home could be sold for 1.6 million, then it would seem the math is if you convert it to a duplex, each of those duplexes, if they're 1,500, 2,000 square feet, they would be roughly $800,000, correct? Because there is no incentive to a developer to sell something for less than the market if they sold it for 1.6. How is that? I mean, if you're taking a home that's worth 600,000, turning it into 2 units that are now worth 800,000, how has that created more attainable housing?
Oh, yeah. Sure. So I think right now we're already seeing the transformation of our neighborhoods to the tear down rebuild process. You know, I know for doing a lot of the analysis that Kensington has seen a ton of tear down rebuilds. The reality is the tear downs aren't going away. We have to make a competitive process to the tear down rebuild process. And we know that that duplex, that $800,000 duplex, is a lot more affordable than that that $1.6 million new detached home.
Exactly. And what we've seen from other areas and other jurisdictions is you don't get those houses that end up having duplexes more than. If you do that, you end up with a tri or something else. Like typically there are more moderate and more middle income folks than there are very wealthy folks. And so we're not seeing that in areas that have adopted broader based attainable housing strategies where we see duplexes, triplexes, multiplexes. We're not seeing that. If we were seeing that in those jurisdictions, it would be a different consideration. But they will be more affordable and more attainable than what would be built over the house. The houses that are getting torn down are either ones that need so much work that they're mostly uninhabitable long-term. They need a heavy amount of investment in either rehabbing the house or putting something else on it. And we're not seeing in other jurisdictions that the multiplexes are more expensive per unit than the house they replace. They tend to be cheaper, particularly when you adopt a broad-based approach. And that's kind of what we're doing here. The targeted smaller-based approach, if you don't really affect the supply, region-wide or county-wide, you can get some of those situations. Is one reason why we recommended that it be as broad-based as possible to be as equitable as possible. And it's one reason we recommended the parking, because that also drives down the price. And then the other part is reducing the square footage. You can't charge as much for a smaller square foot home, and you can put more of them.
Just to put a little bit of a finer point on that, we have studied that tear down market pretty extensively. The custom home builders target homes that are sold between 30th and 7th percentile of market. So they're not going for that market rate house that's habitable. They're going for the ones that are below market in order to build that tear down.
Yeah.
You'd mentioned other jurisdictions, lessons you've learned from them, and we've looked at nearby jurisdictions in our region, the District of Columbia, Northern Virginia, other parts of Maryland. Recently, Arlington County's missing middle law was taken to the court and provisions of it were struck down. Additionally, if this question is correct, and I do not know if this is, so correct me if I'm wrong, but DC reverted some of its zoning to not allow missing middle. What lessons is the county looking at with other jurisdictions and the processes they're going through, and what are they doing to inform the council on adjustments that may be needed to this plan before it's considered for legislation?
Sure. So I'm not, so DC, I don't know about the missing middle thing for DC, but we have, talked extensively about Arlington from what we understand. And I want to be clear that there was no opinion on the case, that we're waiting for a transcript, which is supposed to be released on October 25th. I believe every jurisdiction that's considering that is waiting anxiously on that transcript. But from what we understand from people that were in the courtroom is that a lot of the issues were procedural. The tree ordinance issue, and then there were other issues. We actually haven't started the formal process yet, so there's no procedural issues at this point, which is just a study. But we will also obviously, we will be in close contact with the council's lawyers when we understand what happened in Arlington to make sure that we don't repeat those mistakes.
And just to add on to that, we are attempting to be as transparent and open as possible and have been throughout the process, even before the starting of the formal process, that, as Councilmember Stewart mentioned, the 30 days, the public hearings, all that kind of thing that's required. We're trying to be as open and transparent with everybody as possible to affect that.
Earlier, when talking about infrastructure, there was I specifically asked about Potomac and other regions that were being left out of the strategy right now. Not those regions because they have their own zoning, but rather those that you mentioned had insufficient infrastructure to accommodate this type of density change. So the question is, why is it then that places like Kensington or Chevy Chase or Silver Spring should be punished simply because we do have the infrastructure?
I guess I just don't see attainable housing strategies as a punishment. I think that new residents are of value to this community. I think new neighbors are great, but I mean, you know, I understand others may not see differently, but I just don't agree with that
Yeah.
premise.
I fundamentally disagree with the concept too. I think people are a benefit. The economy benefits from people. The neighborhoods benefit from folks. I think people are a benefit, and I don't think this is a punishment. Now, we're talking about, we have spread this very widely across the county through a whole set of zones, through small and large, and any place that are close to infrastructure, particularly sewer and water, and particularly transportation. I fundamentally disagree with the idea that people are a punishment or a burden.
So, yep, I'm gonna keep going through. I got a whole list of them. But on that, there's a follow-up along that.
I'm
line.
happy to stay as long as possible
Yeah.
afterwards. If anybody wants to talk to me, I'm more than happy to be here.
And out of curiosity, I'm just trying to make sure I get through everybody's question for those who have written them down. So to that, from a municipal level, and I will speak only from my knowledge of Kensington and not our neighboring jurisdictions, but we are an older established community that has infrastructure problems. Well, we have a built infrastructure. It is insufficient for the density that we already have based on changing climate and the real effects of 10, 50-year or 100-year storm events, which are they are happening more regularly with more intensity. We have currently stormwater drain pipes that are 12 inches that need to be closer to 24 inches or larger. What did planning do to look at the specific real infrastructure of different parts of the county when they drafted this plan? Was any consideration given to the actual built infrastructure as opposed to whether it existed or didn't exist?
Sure. So I don't think that we didn't, you know, look at every community affected. We looked at general concepts and topics. Stormwater management is a big one that has come up, you know, quite a lot. The code is silent on the protections for what multi-unit structures would have to do for stormwater. The report recommends that that a change be made, that stormwater provisions that apply to detached homes apply to multi-unit structures. I think that this is, you know, we can have that conversation about infrastructure too. That doesn't, you know, just because we're talking about attainable housing doesn't preclude other topics being brought into this. You know, right now the report focuses on zoning changes because that was the ask, but that doesn't mean that we're not also talking about stormwater, schools, transportation, things like that. That should be absolutely part of this conversation. But there might be that needs to be separate legislation beyond just a zoning tax amendment.
And we have existing sort of ordinances that address stormwater management. And from the issue of sort of climate change, one of the best ways to address climate change long-term, our own climate goals within Montgomery County, and the larger issue of climate change is density and bringing people closer into the things that they go to. The less miles traveled, the less vehicle miles traveled. If folks aren't here and don't have places to be here, they do not disappear. All right, they go further out. And that's an issue of both traffic infrastructure and overall climate change goals. So one of the things that we have looked at is the closer that you are to infrastructure, the less of it that you use per person. And there are absolutely issues that we need to address, and it will be addressed when, you know, sort of those things come up like any particular project. And then one of the things about the small scale is that it doesn't cover much more than an existing structure would. All right, it's supposed to be a scale that fits into the neighborhood. So you're not adding a great deal of impermeable surfaces. You're not adding a great deal of anything else. And they will be required sort of to address the stormwater issue within the development there. So we're going to honestly improve that through more than anything else.
To that, if you'll give me a moment of grace, I would like to insert my question. You mentioned that when the especially to roadways, if people can't afford to live, they're just moving further out. They still need to get to their employment centers, whether that be downtown Washington, Bethesda, Silver Spring. What those three areas have in common is that to get to them, often you have to cut through Kensington. We see our ridership numbers along the 3 state highways that, trisect our town, going back to pre-COVID and beyond, 60,000, 65,000 rides per day on Connecticut Avenue. But at the same time, the county keeps pushing off transportation projects. The only transportation projects that they have identified, specifically Summit Avenue Extended, they are pushing them off to saying that, they aren't necessarily needed. We have worked very hard with our council member. We've worked very hard to convince the county executive, but if people are moving further out, they still have to get to work, and to get to work, they're coming through Kensington. How does this address the reality that it is going to create more miles driven across the county?
That's a great question. I think that's a very valid concern. I think that this might not have a place in attainable housing strategies. We not looking at the capacity of roadways, but I think it's one of those other topics that, is not just a problem that's specific to attainable housing. It's already an existing process, and it's the same with stormwater, tree canopy, other issues that we are seeing that have been brought up many times that need to be addressed in conjunction with this tool. But I don't think it should preclude that this proposal either.
And I think just to add on to that, we have pushed and continue to push at the Planning Commission for the transit options that exist that are on the books. We want more BRT. We want more both-way mark and more frequent mark transportation. We want those transit options to be there, and we're pushing for them. We're planning for them. It's coming before the board, and we're supporting them wholeheartedly. The thing is that if they're closer to here, and within the whole attainable housing strategies is around their ability to access infrastructure and transit. We want them not to be driving from Frederick or driving from only in. We want them to be closer in and closer to where they want to be, minimizing the amount of time that they have to travel, minimizing the amount of distance they have to travel, minimizing the output of the cars that they have. We want to minimize that, get them closer to the transit infrastructure that we have and the employment infrastructure that we have, rather than the house that they can afford being in Frederick County.
So a resident asks, I live in Kensington, and I feel that this will hurt my property value. What would you say to that comment?
I think so. One of the interesting thing about property values is we've heard both. We've heard that it will hurt my property values, but we've also heard that now you can do more with my property, so it'll increase the property values. The planning board and planning staff is not an expert. We did reach out to the State Department of Assessment and Taxation for clarification on this issue. They released, unfortunately, a very vague letter on this issue that's attached to the report that basically says, it basically says that we don't know. But when we talked to them, they mentioned, it's usually based, your values is based on comps, and there's just not a lot of comps for multi-unit structures because it's not allowed right now in new construction. So I know that's a very unsatisfying answer, but all I can do is direct you to the letter that we received from SDAT.
Yeah, and more broadly, we haven't seen that in the other jurisdictions that have adopted this, that property values go down. It's not really the case. We haven't seen situations where that's been the case. Most of the value of any property is within the land itself, not necessarily the structure that's on it itself, and that doesn't really affect that portion of it as much. What we've seen in sort of Austin, Minneapolis, other places that you can see research on. So it's a valid question. I understand what people are concerned with. We have not seen it in other places, and I see no reason we would expect it here.
If, directly to that point, the land value, the cost of the land is one of the biggest contributing factors to creating attainable housing. Why not create priority housing districts in the part of the county where land is less expensive, not along the jurisdictions, be it transit or the Thrive growth area corridors? Why not focus it in other areas where we can start at a lower land basis?
I think the best transit infrastructure is down county, though, where we have put the priority housing district. I think that's a great question. I would say that there's still an emphasis of building attainable housing strategies in those parts of the county and in Germantown and Olney, for example. But the best transit structure, the purple line that's coming and the red line, and a lot of the upcoming BRT is down county.
Again, infrastructure and equity, we want this to be as broad-based a proposal as possible. Again, the county council asked us how you get more attainable housing and more affordable housing, colloquially speaking. And what you do is you do this as broadly based as possible. So if somebody wants to do it in Olney, they can do it in Olney. And if they want it in Chevy Chase, they can do it in Chevy Chase. It's an equity issue as much as it is a practicality issue. And again, as we said multiple times, infrastructure density is greatest down county. And so if you want this to be a practical issue and a practical piece of policy, it needs to be as broad-based as possible. That's what they asked us for, and that's what we provided.
Similar to an earlier question, but with a little bit of slightly different approach. What incentives are there for homeowners to convert their properties rather than developers? So to put it another way, there's a specific homeowner here who mentioned that while they are in the R60, they'd like to know, is there a possibility, is there any process to convert their property from R60 to a CR zone to create additional flexibility of what they could build on their property?
So let's start with the first part there. There's no incentives. The report does list some potential incentives that would be considered, separate from any zoning changes. There is a process to rezone your property from R60 to a CR zone. It's called the local map amendment process. It is lengthy and it is expensive, unfortunately. The best bet is to wait for a master plan where that process is generally done by planning board and the county council for free. But if you want to learn more about that process, I'm actually going to have Matt Folden raise his hand in the audience. He is the regulatory supervisor for the Mid-County Division and can answer questions about that local map amendment process better than I can.
So Lisa covered sort of the local map amendment. We don't provide incentives within this report because we weren't, really asked to. We have discussed and have sort of looked at sort of marginally about sort of catalysts that would improve and increase the ability of individuals to make these adjustments for their home or make these adjustments for their property if they would like. I think just this is me speaking from my background and experience in affordable housing, a lot of these upgrades in unit numbers would be, especially with the small scale, attainable to a homeowner with something like a HELOC or something like that to produce a duplex or an ADU or an accessory apartment or something like that. So for the small scale, for a lot of homeowners that have some existing equity, I imagine it would be attainable for them to take out a HELOC home equity loan and use that as you would use to do any improvement to your house. It would just be a larger scale. We have some anecdotal evidence of that in places like Minneapolis and Austin. Austin's relatively recent, so it's harder to say. Seattle and a couple of other places that's sort of where it starts to pick up once the home builders and the teardown market has sort of gotten used to it. So that's me speaking mostly from my professional background.
So Kevin, earlier you had mentioned that we see two types of income levels that are really coming into the county. Very high income levels, very low income levels, and we are losing that middle band. So we had a discussion around the income level, but what data does county planning have around what the actual size of home people need to stay here or to move here? So specifically, do you think 1,500 square feet units might be too small for the needs of many small families?
I'll answer that one very quickly. I have a small family. I have 5 and I live in a home that's smaller than 1,500 square feet. It's perfectly fine. We have looked at housing size and we had extensive discussion on housing size. It was one of the comments that we got from the public hearings before we finished the attainable housing strategies, whether we would want to limit the optional method to 2,000, 1,800, or 1,500 square feet. Square footage is a really important aspect of how much overall you can charge within the market for attainable housing. It's one reason that we kept it low. is to make sure that for at least the optional method, that people were getting houses that were both family-sized and affordable or attainable for them. So we have looked at that. We have looked at moderate-sized homes, and Lisa put up the data that we have on the size of homes currently being produced. And we need both sort of the number of units and the size of the unit to be family-sized if people want that. And so that's where we settled on about 1,500 square feet for that. So we have looked at it, generally speaking, and that's where we came down. That's probably fairly flexible, but it can't be terribly more than that. Or you really start getting into housing that is cost per square foot prohibitive for that moderate and middle income area of the market that we're trying to focus on. I feel like I should turn more over here.
So, to that, on that very, you talk about this middle income bracket that we're trying to create new housing for using missing middle style of housing. But how does AHS actually ensure that these units at 1,500 square feet that are attainable and aimed at middle income residents would actually go to middle income residents?
So we have no assurances. I can say, there's a really good example of a condo building in downtown Silver Spring, the Octave, that was an adaptive reuse office building. And a lot of the units were micro units. They, built, 500 square feet or a little bit bigger. And there was no income test to get them, but because of the size, they naturally attracted first-time home buyers. And about 80% of them went to first-time home buyers that were in that income range. So I think that size, while we can't guarantee that these units will go to middle income households, we can probably say that most of them will, given that you are naturally attracted to that what you can fit in your income.
Yeah, just what we've said a couple of times now is it's the breadth of the policy across the county that allows for it to fluctuate based on the sort of the micro market within the region, and then making sure we limit size for different types of housing so that the square footage doesn't run the cost up. And these are policies that were put in place so that we mostly get houses that are affordable to the attainable housing, for the attainable housing folks that we're looking for, the middle and moderate income folks. And I mean, that's what we're trying to do here. They asked us for our best estimates of how to do it, and that's what we gave them.
So earlier, when we were talking about Potomac, you had said they were largely excluded because of a lack of infrastructure. Yet, when the question of infrastructure impact came up, you said that Attainable Housing Strategy Study doesn't really consider infrastructure. Why is there an inconsistency between those two things?
I don't think there's an inconsistency in those two things. And if we were not clear, let me apologize for that, is that we're not considering an infrastructure as if this is a site plan for each individual parcel, for each individual area. When somebody comes up for permit that goes to DPS under the small scale or under the optional method, they will go through the permitting process and they will be subject to all the ordinances that we have that are on the books. That's all going to be something that's happened each time it's site plan. What we're saying is we didn't micro target any neighborhoods for specific things. So if you are in Kensington and you do have stormwater management issues with the size of, with the size of the sewer pipes, then that's something that will come up during the permitting process and the APFO process for either the optional method or the small scale by right development. What we're talking about is, broadly speaking, on a policy level, we're attempting to both take the broadest possible part of the county that we can without including pieces of the county that simply don't have sewer systems, like in much of Potomac. So if it is in Potomac, it's within the infrastructure envelope that we set, they count. And everybody counts. That's the whole part of one of the attainable housing strategies. It is meant to be as broadly based as possible. The specifics of infrastructure for any individual site or any individual project will come up at the permitting or the optional method when they come for site plan. So we will address all those infrastructure issues that are specific to a particular area or a particular site when it comes up for permitting. And if it doesn't make it, it doesn't make it, and it doesn't get built. Now, for a policy level, like I said, we're trying to be as broadly based as possible. We're trying not to focus on any one area and put all of this on any one neighborhood. This is an equity issue. The county has a housing supply issue and a housing affordability issue countywide, and we're trying to address it countywide.
So you mentioned a couple times the attainable housing optional method. And in the presentation, we know that small scale and some medium scale, because of our priority housing district, will certainly envelope Kensington. But you showed a map specific to Kensington of the growth, the Thrive growth corridor along Connecticut Avenue. There are a number of properties in there shaded in blue that would be eligible under the attainable housing optional method for large scale.
Medium scale,
Medium scale, which is up to how many units?
19.
19.
There's where the question comes in. 19, there's a lot of concern that 19 seems like a arbitrary non-round number, but it happens to be right under the threshold of requiring moderately priced dwelling units.
So that's not true.
I'm going to let you talk.
Oh, sorry.
That's exactly what I'm going. The question is, how will attainable housing strategy impact the county's MPDU program?
Sure. So there is a requirement to make a payment to the Housing Initiative Fund, which is the county's housing trust fund, when you build 11 to 19 units. So there is a contribution to the county's affordable housing coffers for building 11 to 19 units. I don't think that we chose, 19 units for any particular reason. I think that, certainly there is like a misunderstanding that we use it just to get rid of to not hit the MPDU program. But like I said, there is a payment. There is an economies at scale at place when building affordable housing. We don't see a lot of 20-unit developments in the county for that reason. When we very rarely see any multifamily buildings under 50 units, just because it's really hard to subsidize an MPDU if you're building less than 50 units.
Yeah, and so with I'll say for the optional housing or the attainable housing optional method, it also includes the stacked flats and the townhomes and things like that. So what we're trying to do there is both accommodate small scale apartment structures if they're if they're reasonable for the market, as well as things like townhomes and stacked flat style things. So the 19 unit cutoff is essentially an arbitrary distinction between what we called medium scale and what was called large scale. And large scale, one of the reasons that we put it at 19 is large scale requires to go through the master planning process if you want to put the large scale corridor zone on something, which requires then all of the public input and all the public process. The optional method at slightly smaller scale still requires public hearings and an optional method and coming before the planning board. And so, we could have made it 25, we could have made it 30, we could have made it 15, 19 seemed like about the good, reasonable medium. And it's about what we sort of see being built in other places, but that fluctuates a lot based on the market and things like that. So trying to distinguish between larger scale, which is going to be 20 or more, where it has to go through a full master planning process, and the optional method where it has to come before the planning board and be approved. It's basically the distinction.
Earlier, Kevin, I think it was you talked about what market rate. I'd use the example of a replacement home at 1.6 million. If it were to be duplexes, that would mean they'd each have to be 800,000. You had made a comment that what you're seeing maybe in other jurisdictions, the hope is that actually what would occur is 2 to 3, maybe 4 units, right? And these different characteristics, but coming up to a total value less than what the replacement value, a replacement home would be, correct?
Actually, more often than not, we do see it slightly over what the total cost is, slightly over what the scale would have been for a replacement larger scale house. So we do see some increase in value of the land and the units on it, but they're still well below what 1 unit would be worth on that particular piece of land. So it doesn't typically end up that 1.6 becomes 2 at 800. It's often, and that's not really a great example. It's an awfully expensive parcel to do this kind of development on with home builders. But say you take a house that's, in the county that would look good at 600, and you might get 2 at 400 or 2 at 450 or something along those lines. So we see them as less costly and more attainable, but it doesn't usually meet to a 2 to 1 or a 3 to 1 type of thing. But the more that you can, the lower the cost per unit overall has to be, typically because you're spreading the land value out among multiple units.
One question has to do with allowing for higher vertical builds than what is currently allowed. Right here in the town of Kensington, we're 2.5 stories. But if you allow 3 to 4 stories, you can get additional square footage by going up. Mm-hmm. Does that not? So the example that was written here is there was a property in the town that was sold for $560,000. Single-family home, 3,600 square feet. It resulted in the building of, I believe it's 6 townhouses. The average sale price is $1.04 million. They are averaging 2,000 square feet. How has that created attainable housing?
And there's two things about that. The first being that it is, those prices are less than the single unit would have been on that spot and are less, so we see that. The second is that as you spread these out amongst the county and you make it a broader base, it increases the attainability of the units that are produced. It increases the attainability and the affordability of the unit produced. If you're only able to do that in very narrow circumstances in a very small parts of the county with a lot of effort and a lot of cost, it increases the cost for those units overall. If you can do it more broadly, that means more competition in the housing market. This is not a set of strategies or a program that is meant to push all housing prices down as low as they can go. It is one that is meant to address the fact that when we see tear downs happen, we see them being replaced, small homes being replaced with very large homes that are out of reach for almost anyone in the county. And that's something that we're trying to address. This is not going to produce housing that is available for folks at the very bottom end of the income spectrum. We're not saying that's not what it's supposed to do. But we do see them as being, when these homes, when these multi-units buildings are built, we see them cost considerably less than the original home or a replacement would have, than a replacement home would have been.
So the next question is a bit of a look into a specific residence demographics. So they say they are a property owner in the town. They own a 1,900 square foot home. They have a household income of $300,000 a year. That results in a mortgage payment currently of $4,600. He's in the top 5% of AM by wealth. However, when he looks at other homes available for sale in town, they average somewhere above $1 million. The homes nearby are 1.3, $1.4 million. Those are larger, 2,700 and 5,000 square feet, but result in mortgages closer to $7,000 to $10,000. So based on that, the comment is that he and his family could not afford to move into this town today if, under the current circumstances, and believes that 95% of Americans couldn't either. So the question is, if the county does not address the issue by building additional missing middle type housing, what will the demographic shift of the county and our community become?
Unless you want to, I can take some of it. I mean, we've seen, and we have the demographics, and a lot of it is linked on the attainable housing strategies. What we'll end up with, I think, if we do this long-term without addressing the housing issue, the housing affordability and the housing supply issue, is you'll end up with a bifurcated county. You'll end up with a county of very wealthy people and a county of very low-income people, and that middle and moderate income group of folks will not be there. Because that is exactly the situation I find myself in now, over a decade after I moved to Montgomery County. I moved in, as I mentioned, I bought a house from a woman who was 78 years old and had lived there for several decades. My house now costs the houses in the neighborhood, and it's all the same because it was the same developer that built them in 1954. And they just turned them one face, and then they turned them around and faced them backwards, and then they did it again. All right, that's how you build cheap houses in the 1950s. And the houses around me are now going for 45% more than they went for when I bought my home 10 years ago. I could not afford to live where I live right now, and I could not afford to live in Montgomery County on the income I make now 10 years later, much less what I made when I moved here. I like living here. I like raising my family here. I want that opportunity to be available for other people in the future, for other folks like me that have young families. All right, that's one of the reasons that I do what I do. It's one of the reasons I've done affordable housing my entire life and my entire career. It's one of the reasons that I push through a lot of this attainable housing stuff right now. I want what I have to be available to more people.
So on that note, there's a question of, we have an issue of rising home prices. We've talked about supply and demand, that one of the things the county is looking at is we need to increase the supply, that homes, to your point, are going for 45% more than they were 10 years ago. But consequently, wages are not rising at the same level. Why is more attention not being given to what the county needs to do to create more jobs at higher wage rates, to increase pay so that it is keeping with the rising cost of housing?
Can I defer to Councilmember Stewart? That might be- Yeah, that's not, I'm not saying that that's out of the purview of the planning board, but again, the attainable housing report, and I'm sorry to, if Lisa, you wanted to, not to monopolize the conversation, but we were asked, how do we make housing cheaper? Not how do we make, more, how do we increase the economy and things like that within Montgomery County? I will say from my own background and from my own experience and from doing this for a long time, both with the federal government and at the local level, is more housing means more economic development because people are the economy. That's what the economy is. The economy is the manifestation of what people do with their time and money. And if there's more folks, there will be more businesses because the businesses want the folks to come and work for them. And they want to get the folks where they have places that they can live and buy homes. If you look at the literature on business location, where businesses tend to go, where they choose to go, one of the things that they look for is infrastructure. The other thing they look for is employees. And employees, we need those middle and moderate income folks. One of the things that we have in Montgomery County, and we get these reports all the time and the county council does as well. One of the growth industries in Montgomery County is life sciences, right? So when you think of life sciences, you might think of NIH and all of the federal stuff that we have. Lots of scientists with lots of degrees getting paid, 6 figures plus. That's very important. But there's also a bulk within the life sciences that's technicians that get paid $40,000, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year that actually drop the stuff into the pipettes and move them from one place to another and put them in refrigerators. And there's the administrators that work for those kind of things. So the economy in Montgomery County not only needs folks that make 6 figures, 130,000, 150,000 a year, scientists like that. We need those moderate and middle income folks to be within the county so we can have an economy that develops. Those people aren't here. If they're too far away, they're not going to come here. We're not competing only within our own region for people, for workers and employees. We're competing against North Carolina and Boston for things like life science centers and stuff like that. So one of the things, this is beyond the purview of the attainable housing strategies, but it is something we look at the planning board, is if you want an economy to thrive, you have to build a place, you have to build communities where everybody can come and live and work. And right now we are losing part of that. And that's one of the reasons that we were asked for this report. It's one of the reasons that we gave the best recommendations we could.
I don't have much to add except that, housing is one of our Achilles heel when businesses talk about why they do and do not locate here. It's so much to the point that MCDEC included housing affordability in their strategic plan as a way to attract a workforce. So I think it's something that it's not, an or situation, it's an and situation.
It's 8:52. I have more questions than I can get to by 9 o'clock. If I do not get to your question, I apologize. I think they've each said they'll stay after a little bit, but I'm going to try and get in as many as I can here. One of them is a procedural question around what happens when planning interacts with council and gets the county council any sort of legislation. So we've talked about whether that's zoning text amendment or a local map amendment, but the other part of it is the pattern book. It is my understanding the pattern book does not exist today. You have looked at different pattern books from other jurisdictions, but planning will need to draft a pattern book that needs to be included with any sort of legislation so that it can be looked at holistically. That's my first question. Is that a correct understanding? And then second would be, based on just where you're at right now, how long do you think it would take to draft a pattern book?
Sure. So I think that's a question that's up for debate is whether, once the council agreed to the pattern book concept, should there, they want to introduce ZTA, and 2, do we need to have that pattern book complete in order to consider this legislation? I don't think we've given, we don't know that at this point. I would say that we've talked it could take us anywhere from, I think, 4 to 6 months to develop the pattern book. We want to do it well. We understand how important it is. We want to engage the community on the pattern book. That is more of a stay tuned question.
What other protections have you considered at all around, again, who might be buying these attainable units? So the question is, what prevents a buyer from buying multiple units and then aggregating them back to a single family structure? From a zoning process, is there, what can they do that? What also prevents somebody from short-term rentals where we are not getting a housing unit, we're getting a Airbnb in these units, or for an investment.
Sure, so I'll start with the Airbnb. So in the accessory dwelling unit update, we prohibited Airbnbs from being in those units. That is something that we could consider here. In terms of aggregation, you are in the interior of single-family neighborhoods, you are limited to a quadplex. You can't aggregate them and build a small apartment building. On the corridors, you are limited to a small apartment building. You can't aggregate it and build a 20-foot high rise. So there is limitations within the scope of attainable housing.
What are you doing to help prevent the loss of tree canopy and green space with the increased density that AHS is proposing?
Sure, I think it's one of those things that, it's really important. I think about myself, we were talking to another neighborhood about tree canopy that was outside downtown Silver Spring. And I just remember my COVID walks, enjoying that tree canopy. And I think that's a really important part of this. We want to diminish the loss of those trees. I think that's something that the pattern book can cover about how to be thoughtful with the building placement to minimize the loss of trees. I also think that we can look at our tree canopy law holistically with not just attainable housing strategies in mind, but also, look at, how because we've heard similar complaints for the tear down rebuilds that exist right now about the loss of tree canopy. So I think that should be looked at holistically.
Yeah, same here with you cover most of it. We also have an existing sort of forest preservation law. And like I said, we can look at the tree canopy requirements. Nothing in here do we want or desire for there to be less tree canopy. We've talked about it in a number of other policies that we put out. Complete streets guide, things like that, where we are requiring and want to, within the master plans, require there to be more tree coverage and to be more tree canopy. It produces heat islands and a bunch of other benefits.
Question is simply, won't AHS just accelerate the loss of starter homes within the county?
Sure. I would say, I don't think it'll accelerate. I think it will happen in the existing tear down rebuild market that's already existing. I don't think that there will be an increase in them. We don't know what we don't know, but, looking at other jurisdictions, that are our best understanding of how this will work.
Yeah, I think you can see also from the data that we have on the website and some of a little bit of what Lisa provided today is that there are not a lot of starter homes left that are single family detached. The ones that are smaller are being pushed up. The ones that are smaller and in bad shape are being torn down. We don't have a lot of land left for single family homes, most to be starter homes for the most part right now. As I said before, I can't afford what I have now if it were the price that it's going for in my neighborhood. So I don't think it'll accelerate that. I think what it does is provide another outlet for starter home market. If that's what you're interested in, is these duplexes and triplexes, townhomes, stacked flats that would be attainable and affordable for folks that are looking to get a starter home.
One of the last questions, you've been working on attainable housing for a couple of years. I mean, it started earlier on at the same time as Thrive. The housing market has shifted a little bit. Interest rate, other national numbers, inflation are shifting. National policies are shifting. So the question is, why wouldn't this initiative simply be overwhelmed by inflationary forces created by national policies, not local, which are far more powerful than what the county can control or influence?
I can go after part of that.
Sure.
As part of my day job. I work for the Federal Housing Finance Agency in my day job. The inflationary pressure, what it mostly does, this is a very wonky response that will be quite wonky because I work locally and I work nationally at my day job, is mostly what the inflationary pressure does when interest rates rise is make people stay in their homes and not move. So what it does is decrease supply overall because you can't get a better interest rate than you have right now, because if you bought the house like I did and then refinanced it and I bought today, my interest rate would be 2 or 3 times what it is right now. And so I don't want to move because I can't get anything for the same price that I get something right now. So what the inflationary pressure tends to do within the housing market is depress the amount of supply. The fundamental underlying problem that we have is one of supply. So as you get interest rates that are lowering, you will both at the national level improve the opportunity for people to buy homes and for people to move to different homes that they want, thereby freeing up their home to be sold. And you will also see it be more reasonable and more possible for people to get the mortgage that they need to purchase one of these attainable homes. So it's going to work synergistically is my hope. But there are absolutely situations if you had something like 1970s level stagflation, where interest rates went up to 15%. That's nothing that we can control, but we can affect the local supply.
So with that, we are at 9 o'clock. I did my best to get through as many of all the questions that were sent in or handed up. What I want to do now, though, is turn and thank Lisa Gavoni and James Hedrick from the Planning Board as a commissioner, as well as Matthew Folden, for agreeing to come in and educate the community further, present the attainable housing strategies. I also want to thank all of you who are here in person and who have given questions to lead to this discussion. I want to thank everybody who has watched at home with Montgomery Municipal Cable. Thank you to Mayor Furman and the Town Council, and to Councilmember Kate Stewart from the County Council, who is here for the full time listening to all of your concerns. She has also said she will stay back for a few moments if you have additional comments or concerns. I also want to thank Montgomery Municipal Cable, who has been here to help us live stream this, as well as they will record it. It will be available for others to watch on Montgomery Municipal Cable, specifically to Albert and to Carly. Thank you for your help tonight, making it go smoothly. And so with that, we are concluded. I thank you all for attending this evening.